The crackling static of a 911 call pierces through the serene morning air of Yellowstone National Park. Oh God, there's a woman. Yellowstone, near the Old Faithful area? A bison just. She's not moving. There's blood everywhere. The caller's voice trembles with shock, breathing heavily between words. The Upper Geyser Basin Trail. Please hurry. The bison is still here. It's just standing over her. In the pristine wilderness of Yellowstone National Park, where thermal features paint the landscape with otherworldly colors and wildlife roams. Free as they have for millennia, what began as a solo backpacker's dream adventure would become a nightmare that sent shockwaves through the outdoor community. The morning mist still clung to the valley floor, creating an ethereal atmosphere that would soon be shattered by violence. Sarah Chen was 22 years old, a recent Columbia University graduate with a degree in environmental science and a passion for wildlife photography that had taken her to some of the most remote corners of North America. She had no idea that her final Instagram post, showing her smiling beside a warning sign about wildlife safety, would become a haunting reminder of how quickly paradise can turn deadly. This is Sarah Chen's story. A story of youthful confidence, the majesty of North American megafauna, and the moment when a 2,000-pound bison decided that this young woman had crossed an invisible line that should never be crossed. What makes this tragedy even more haunting is that the entire attack was captured on camera by fellow hikers, creating a visceral record of how respect for wildlife can mean the difference between life and death. You're watching Wildlife Encounters Uncovered, where we bring you the most shocking real-life animal encounters from around the world. If this story grips you, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon, because what you're about to witness will change how you see America's most iconic national park forever. This isn't just another wildlife video, it's a stark reminder that in places where wild animals reign supreme, one moment of poor judgment can cost everything. Sarah Chen wasn't just another tourist with a camera phone hoping to capture the perfect wildlife selfie. She was a dedicated environmental scientist, a skilled backcountry hiker, and, ironically, someone who had written her senior thesis on human-wildlife conflict in national parks. Her friends would later describe this cruel irony as the most painful part of losing her. Born in 2002 in San Francisco, California, Sarah grew up in a family that valued both academic excellence and outdoor adventure. Her mother, Linda Chen, was a pediatrician at UCSF Medical Center, while her father, James Chen, worked as a software engineer for a major tech company. Despite their urban lifestyle, the Chen family spent nearly every weekend exploring the natural wonders of Northern California. From the towering redwoods of Muir Woods to the rugged coastline of Point Reyes, Sarah learned to love nature before she could properly pronounce the word ecosystem. Her passion for wildlife began at age 7 during a family camping trip to Yosemite. A black bear had wandered into their campsite, and while other children might have been terrified, Sarah sat mesmerized, watching from the safety of their car as the bear investigated their supposedly bear-proof food container. Her father recalls her whispering, "He's not scary, Dad. He's just hungry and curious, like us." That moment of empathy and understanding would shape her entire life's trajectory. Friends describe Sarah as brilliant but approachable, someone who could discuss complex ecological theories one moment and quote The Office the next. Her college roommate, Jessica Martinez, who knew Sarah for all 4 years at Columbia, recalls a young woman who kept field guides on her nightstand instead of fashion magazines. Sarah would get legitimately excited about things like soil composition and migration patterns. Jessica remembers, "She dragged me to Central Park at 5 a.m. just to watch birds during spring migration. I complained every time, but secretly loved how passionate she was about everything in nature." But it was Sarah's confidence in the wilderness that would ultimately lead to that fateful morning in Yellowstone. She believed that her knowledge and respect for wildlife made her different from the average tourist. Her Instagram account, @EcoExplorerSarah, had over 15,000 followers who admired her stunning wildlife photography and thoughtful captions about conservation. She often posted about maintaining safe distances from animals, using telephoto lenses instead of approaching closely, and the importance of leaving no trace. Sarah had spent the previous summer interning with the National Park Service at Glacier National Park, where she assisted with grizzly bear research and visitor education programs. Her supervisors noted her exceptional ability to communicate complex wildlife behavior to tourists, often diffusing potentially dangerous situations where visitors were getting too close to animals. Dr. Mark Williams, who supervised her internship, wrote in her recommendation letter, "Sarah possesses a rare combination of scientific knowledge and practical field skills. She understands wildlife behavior at a level far beyond her years." Yet those who knew Sarah best would later say there was another side to her expertise, a subtle overconfidence that came from spending so much time successfully navigating wild spaces. Her younger brother, Michael, 3 years her junior and a pre-med student at UCLA, observed this. During their last conversation, "She told me she was planning some epic shots in Yellowstone," he recalls, his voice breaking. "I joked that she better not get too close to anything with horns or claws. She laughed and said, 'Mike, I'm not some tourist. I know what I'm doing.' Those words haunt me every day." Sarah's solo backpacking trip through Yellowstone was meant to be a celebration of her graduation and a chance to decompress before starting her dream job with the World Wildlife Fund in Washington, D.C. She had planned the trip meticulously, obtaining all necessary permits, studying trail maps, and even downloading offline wildlife behavior guides to her phone. Her backpack, found intact after the incident, contained bear spray, a first aid kit, and a journal where she had written detailed notes about each day's wildlife sightings. The last entry, dated the night before the attack, reveals a young woman intoxicated by the raw beauty of Yellowstone. She wrote, "Davey saw it. Grizzly and cubs from about 200 yards today near Hayden Valley. Maintained distance, got incredible shots with the 600mm lens. The light was perfect, golden hour painting everything in warm tones. Tomorrow heading to Upper Geyser Basin early to catch wildlife at dawn before the crowds arrive. Hoping to see bison in the mist. It's going to be magical. Mom would worry, but I've never felt more at home than I do in these wild places. This is where I belong." Sarah had encountered bison before during her travels through various national parks. She understood, at least intellectually, that these massive animals were responsible for more injuries in Yellowstone than any other species. She had even shared articles about bison's safety on her social media, warning others about the deceptive speed of these seemingly docile giants. Her faculty advisor at Columbia, Professor Rachel Thompson, remembers Sarah presenting a compelling lecture about megafauna behavior to underclassmen. She showed videos of bison charges, explained their body language, discussed seasonal aggression patterns. She knew all the facts, but knowing and doing, as we learned too late, can be tragically different things. The morning of May 15th began like any other day of Sarah's backpacking adventure. She woke before dawn in her backcountry campsite, methodically packed her gear, and double-checked her camera equipment. Her plan was to reach the Upper Geyser Basin area just as the sun crested the mountains, creating the ethereal misty conditions that made for spectacular wildlife photography. She had done this routine dozens of times in various parks, always alone, always successful. Her confidence wasn't arrogance. It was built on a foundation of experience and knowledge. But in the wilderness, as Sarah was about to learn, confidence without constant vigilance could prove fatal. Bison are North America's largest land mammals, living symbols of the American West that once roamed the continent in herds numbering in the tens of millions. In the wild, these magnificent creatures can weigh up to 2,000 pounds, stand 6 feet tall at the shoulder, and despite their massive bulk, sprint at speeds reaching 35 miles per hour, 3 times faster than the average human can run. Their presence in Yellowstone represents one of conservation's greatest success stories, but also one of its most persistent challenges in managing human-wildlife interactions. The bison that would change Sarah Chen's life forever was a massive bull, estimated by witnesses to weigh approximately 1,800 pounds. Rangers had designated him Bull 2147 in their tracking system, though he bore no visible tags or markings that would identify him to the casual observer. He was approximately 12 years old, in the prime of his life, with a distinctive scar across his left flank from a long-ago territorial dispute. His dark brown coat was still shedding the last remnants of his winter fur, giving him a patchy, ragged appearance that made him look even more formidable. Bull 2147 was well known to park biologists who had been monitoring the Lamar Valley herd for years. Dr. Patricia Hernandez, Yellowstone's senior wildlife biologist, had first documented him as a young bull in 2019. Her field notes described him as notably aggressive during rut, successfully challenging older bulls for mating rights despite his youth. She had observed him charging other bulls, vehicles, and on one occasion, a park research truck that had ventured too close to his preferred grazing area. Sarah first encountered the massive bull at 6:47 a.m. on that fatal morning, according to the timestamp on her camera's memory card recovered. Later, the initial photos showed Bull 2147 approximately 75 yards away, grazing peacefully in the meadow adjacent to the boardwalk trail. The morning mist created an ethereal backdrop, with steam from nearby geysers mixing with the natural fog to create what photographers call magic. Our conditions. Sarah's first shots were taken with appropriate caution, using her telephoto lens from well beyond the park's required 25-yard minimum distance from Bison. For nearly 20 minutes, Sarah photographed the bull from various angles, always maintaining what seemed to be a safe distance. Her images, recovered from her camera, showed artistic composition and patience, the sign of someone who understood wildlife photography. But sometime between 7:05 and 7:10 a.m., something changed. The photo metadata showed Sarah had switched from her 600mm telephoto lens to a 70 to 200mm lens, indicating she had moved significantly closer to her subject. But experts were concerned about several factors that morning that created a perfect storm of danger. Dr. James Morrison, a wildlife behaviorist who has studied Yellowstone's bison for over 2 decades, warned that May represented one of the most dangerous times to encounter bison. Spring is calving season, he explained in a later interview. Bulls are increasingly territorial, cows are protective of newborns, and the entire herd dynamic shifts toward heightened aggression. Add to that the stress of increasing tourist numbers after a quiet winter, and you have animals that are already on edge. Sarah had dismissed these seasonal concerns, perhaps due to her successful previous encounters with bison in other parks during less volatile times of year. She had written in her journal 2 days earlier, "The bison here seem habituated to people, barely glancing up when hikers pass on the boardwalks. Very different from the skittish herds I observed in Wind Cave National Park last summer." This observation, while accurate on the surface, failed to recognize the crucial difference between habituation and tolerance, a distinction that would prove fatal. Warning signs had been mounting throughout that week. Park rangers had received multiple reports of aggressive bison behavior near the Upper Geyser Basin. On May 12, 3 days before Sarah's encounter, a bull had charged a family who ventured off the boardwalk for photos, missing them by mere feet. The next day, another visitor reported being stalked by a large bull that followed them along the trail for nearly a quarter. Park officials had increased signage and ranger patrols, but the sheer size of the area made constant monitoring impossible. The specific location where Sarah encountered Bull 2147 was particularly problematic. The meadow near Morning Glory Pool created a natural bottleneck where wildlife trails intersected with human foot traffic. During early morning hours, bison frequently used this area to access thermal features where they would warm themselves in the cool morning air. Park biologist Dr. Hernandez had actually recommended installing additional barriers in this exact location, noting in a report filed just 2 weeks earlier the convergence of wildlife patterns and tourist routes at coordinates 44.4605 degrees north, 110.8281 degrees west presents an elevated risk for human-wildlife conflict, particularly during dawn and dusk wildlife movement. Periods. Still, Sarah refused to see the danger accumulating around her like storm clouds. The morning's events had begun to draw other early rising photographers and hikers to the area. Witnesses would later report seeing Sarah moving progressively closer to the bull, switching lenses, adjusting positions. Tom Bradley, a wildlife photographer from Montana with 30 years of experience, was setting up his equipment. Approximately 150 yards away, he noticed Sarah's movements with growing alarm. "I saw her crouch down near some fallen logs, maybe 40 yards from the bull," he recalled. "I actually called out to her, said she was too close. She waved and smiled, gave me a thumbs up like everything was fine. She seemed to think the logs provided some kind of barrier or escape route." The fallen logs Sarah was using for cover were remnants of the 1988 Yellowstone fires, weathered silver-gray trunks that created natural photography blinds throughout the park. What Sarah didn't realize was that these logs, while providing visual cover, offered no protection from a charging bison and could actually become deadly obstacles in an escape attempt. Bull 2147 had begun showing signs of agitation, tail raised, head shaking, pawing at the ground, all classic pre-charge behaviors that any experienced wildlife observer should recognize. Another photographer, Linda Walsh from California, was positioned on the opposite side of the meadow with a clear view of both Sarah and the bull. She would later provide crucial testimony about the escalating situation. The bison's entire demeanor changed when she moved to those logs, Walsh stated. He went from casually grazing to fixated on her location. His head came up, ears forward, and he did this thing where he'd take a few steps toward her, then stop and stare. "I've photographed bison for years, and I immediately started packing up my gear. I knew something bad was about to happen." The thermal features in the area added another layer of complexity to the dangerous situation. The ground around Upper Geyser Basin is honeycombed with underground thermal channels, creating unstable surfaces and limiting escape routes. Park safety protocols emphasize that visitors should never leave designated trails in thermal areas, both for resource protection and personal safety. Yet Sarah, in her pursuit of the perfect shot, had positioned herself in an area where her escape options were severely limited by both natural obstacles and thermal dangers. At 7:18 a.m., according to multiple witness accounts and camera timestamps, Bull 2147's agitation reached a critical point. He had stopped grazing entirely and stood facing Sarah's position, his massive head lowered slightly, eyes fixed on the logs where she crouched. The morning mist was beginning to lift, and other visitors were starting to arrive at the nearby Morning Glory Pool boardwalk. Several people noticed the tense standoff developing in the meadow. A group of German tourists began filming with their phones, unknowingly documenting the final moments before North America's largest land mammal would demonstrate why maintaining respectful distances from wildlife isn't just a suggestion, it's a survival imperative. In the 48 hours leading up to May 15th, the behavioral changes in the Upper Geyser Basin bison herd were becoming impossible to ignore. Sarah Chen had noticed the increased bellowing at night from her backcountry campsite, the sound carrying across the valleys like ancient warnings. She had even recorded some of the vocalizations on her phone, planning to use them in a future presentation about wildlife communication. But where she heard fascinating natural behavior worthy of study, experienced park staff heard alarm bells. Chief Wildlife Ranger Marcus Thompson returned to the Upper Geyser Basin on May 13th after receiving multiple concerning reports. His official incident report stated, observed significant aggressive displays among bachelor bulls near thermal features. Bull 2147 specifically exhibited heightened territorial behavior, charging two other bulls and maintaining aggressive posture toward vehicles on Grand Loop Road. Recommend immediate installation of additional warning signage and increased ranger presence during peak visitation hours. His recommendation was still being processed through bureaucratic channels when Sarah began her fatal photography session. Neighbors at the Madison campground, where Sarah had stayed her first night before moving to backcountry sites, began expressing concerns about the unusually bold bison behavior. Robert and Janet Kalinsky, retirees from Michigan in the adjacent RV space, lived through what they called the most terrifying night of our lives on May 12th when a group of bison surrounded their motorhome. We could hear them breathing, rubbing against the RV, Janet later recalled. One bull in particular, massive, with patchy fur, kept circling us. When he scraped his horns along our bedroom wall at 3 a.m., I thought he was going to flip us over. My husband wanted to report it, but the morning rangers said it was normal. Spring behavior, nothing to worry about. Sarah's parents had expressed their own concerns about her solo trip when she'd called them from West Yellowstone 3 days earlier. Dr. Linda Chen tried one last time to convince her daughter to join up with other hikers. I reminded her about that girl who was gored by a bison the previous summer, Linda said, her voice heavy with grief. Sarah just laughed and said, "Mom, that tourist was trying to pet it. I'm a scientist, not an idiot." She had such confidence in her knowledge, her training. We raised her to be independent and strong. Now I wish I'd been the overprotective mother she always teased me about being. But Sarah had developed what Dr. Amanda Richards, a psychological expert in risk assessment and outdoor recreation, calls expert's paradox, a phenomenon where increased knowledge leads to decreased risk perception. Dr. Richards, who has studied hundreds of wildlife incidents, explains Sarah's mindset. When someone accumulates successful experiences in potentially dangerous situations, their brain begins to minimize the actual risk. They start believing their expertise provides immunity. We see this in experienced climbers who forego safety equipment, veteran surfers who paddle out in dangerous conditions, and yes, wildlife professionals who inch closer and closer to their subjects. The very knowledge that should keep them safe becomes the justification for increasingly risky behavior. Sarah's social media activity in her final days revealed this troubling progression. On May 13th, she posted a photo of herself crouched behind a sagebush, photographing a cow elk with a newborn calf from what appeared to be less than 50 yards. The caption read, "Mama was totally cool with me documenting her little one." It's all about reading their body language and energy. When you approach with respect and knowledge, wildlife can sense you're not a threat. Hashtag wildlife whisperer, hashtag Yellowstone magic, hashtag conservation through connection. The post received 847 likes but also several concerned comments from fellow wildlife photographers. Professional photographer David Atkins wrote, "Beautiful shot, Sarah, but that seems really close for a cow with a calf. Please be careful out there." Sarah's response was telling, "Thanks for the concern, David. Don't worry, I had multiple escape routes planned and was reading her signals the whole time. This isn't my first rodeo." On May 14th, less than 24 hours before her fatal encounter, Sarah posted what would become her final Instagram story. It showed her sitting on a log eating trail mix, while 3 bison grazed in the background, seemingly within 100 feet. The video caption read, "Living my best life. These big boys don't even know I'm here. Stealth mode activated. Hashtag invisible observer." Her brother Michael saw the story while studying in his UCLA dorm room and immediately texted her, "Sarah, those bison look way too close. What happened to your telephoto lens?" Her response, sent at 8:47 p.m., was the last direct communication her family would receive. "Relax, baby bro. The 600mm is for tourists. Real wildlife photography happens when you become part of the environment. Trust me, I've got this." Wildlife photographer Tom Bradley, who would witness the attack the next morning, had actually encountered Sarah the previous evening near Grand Prismatic Spring. They struck up a conversation about bison photography, and Bradley was immediately concerned by her approach. Told me she discovered that if you move slowly and avoid direct eye contact, you can get within 30 or 40 yards without disturbing them, Bradley recalled. I tried to explain that bison aren't horses, they're wild animals with a prey response that can trigger instantly. She listened politely, but I could tell she thought I was just another overcautious old-timer. She actually said, "I appreciate the concern, but I've developed my own methods, based on scientific observation." The confidence in her voice was absolute. The morning of May 15th brought unusual atmospheric conditions that would contribute to the tragedy. A temperature inversion had created a thick layer of fog in the valleys, reducing visibility to less than 50 yards in some areas. Park meteorologist Dr. Sandra Mueller later explained, "These conditions are particularly dangerous for wildlife viewing. The fog muffles sound and obscures visual cues. Animals can seem to appear out of nowhere, and humans can inadvertently find themselves much closer to wildlife than intended." We recorded visibility at 6 a.m. that morning at approximately 40 yards in the Upper Geyser Basin area. Sarah woke at 4:30 a.m. in her backcountry campsite, according to the activity log on her GPS watch. She broke camp efficiently, reaching the Upper Geyser Basin area by 6:15 a.m. Security camera footage from the Old Faithful Visitors Center parking lot showed her vehicle arriving in near complete darkness, her headlamp visible as she organized her camera gear. She spent several minutes at her car, likely debating which equipment to bring. Investigators would later find her 600mm telephoto lens still in its case in her vehicle, a decision that would prove catastrophic. The last normal interaction anyone had with Sarah was at 6:23 a.m. when she encountered Park Ranger Julie Martinez conducting early morning rounds. Ranger Martinez later testified, "I saw her heading toward the boardwalk with her camera gear. I reminded her about the 25-yard rule for bison and mentioned we'd had some aggressive behavior reported in that area. She smiled, showed me her bear spray, and said, 'Don't worry, I'm just hoping to catch some sunrise shots of the geysers. If I see any wildlife, I'll keep my distance.' She seemed knowledgeable, prepared. There was no reason to think. I replay that conversation every day, wondering if I should have said more." By 6:45 a.m., Sarah had positioned herself near the Morning Glory Pool area, where the convergence of thermal features and grazing meadows created ideal conditions for the dramatic wildlife photography she sought. The fog was beginning to lift slightly, creating layers of visibility that would have been photographically stunning. Her camera's memory card showed she spent the first several minutes photographing the interplay of steam and fog, the ethereal landscape shots that were her signature style. Then, at 6:47 a.m., Bull 2147 emerged from the fog like a prehistoric ghost. Sarah's first photos of him were haunting in their beauty, the massive bison materializing from the mist, backlit by the rising sun, steam from his nostrils mixing with the geyser vapor. These images, technically perfect and artistically composed, would become evidence in the investigation that followed. They showed an artist at work, someone who understood light and composition, but fatally misunderstood the subject she was capturing. Everything was about to change forever. The stage was set for a collision between human ambition and natural instinct, between artistic vision and survival imperative, between a young woman who thought she understood the wild and an animal that would prove understanding isn't enough. Saturday, May 15th, 7:10 a.m. The morning air hung thick with moisture, creating a mystical atmosphere where geothermal steam merged with natural fog to form an otherworldly landscape. The temperature hovered at 38 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that each breath created small clouds of vapor. Sarah Chen adjusted her camera settings for the low light conditions, her fingers slightly numb despite her photographer's gloves. She had been awake for nearly 3 hours, running on adrenaline and instant coffee, her mind focused entirely on capturing the perfect shot that would define her portfolio. Bull 2147 was positioned approximately 60 yards north of Sarah's location, his massive frame partially obscured by drifting steam from a small thermal feature. He had spent the night in this meadow, one of his preferred grazing areas during the spring months. The bull had been feeding intermittently since before dawn, pulling up the fresh spring grass with methodical movements of his enormous head. His winter coat was patchy and unkempt, hanging in long strips along his flanks where the seasonal shedding was incomplete. To the untrained eye, he appeared calm, almost sedentary. But his tail hung loose and low, occasionally twitching at flies that didn't exist, a subtle sign of growing irritation that Sarah, despite her education, failed to recognize. At approximately 7:12 a.m., Sarah made a critical decision that would seal her fate. She carefully moved from her position behind a large boulder, near the boardwalk, to a cluster of fallen logs approximately 40 yards closer to the bull. Her movements were slow and deliberate, employing the stalking techniques she had learned during her wildlife photography workshops. She kept her profile low, avoided direct eye contact, and moved only when the bull's head was down grazing. From her perspective, she was being respectful and cautious. From the bull's perspective, she was exhibiting predatory behavior. Tom Bradley was setting up his tripod on a small rise approximately 150 yards to the east. Through his binoculars, he watched Sarah's approach with growing concern. She moved like someone who had done this before, he would later tell investigators. Very smooth, very calculated. But she was moving like a predator stalks prey, not like someone trying to avoid confrontation. I've seen mountain lions move like that. No wonder the bull was getting agitated. Bradley began recording video on his camera, initially intending to capture the bison in the morning light. Instead, it would document one of Yellowstone's most preventable tragedies. Bull 2147 had noticed Sarah's initial position behind the boulder but had categorized her as a non-threat, just another human at a safe distance. No different from the thousands he encountered each year. But when she began moving closer, his ancient instincts kicked in. His grazing became sporadic, his head lifting every few seconds to track her movement. Dr. Patricia Hernandez would later explain, bison have evolved for millions of years with predators that hunt exactly the way Sarah was moving. Low profile, using cover, closing distance incrementally. To Bull 2147, she wasn't a photographer, she was exhibiting classic predatory approach behavior. At 7:15 a.m., Linda Walsh arrived at the Morning Glory Pool Boardwalk with her photography group from California. They immediately noticed the tense scene developing in the meadow. My guide grabbed my arm and pointed, Walsh recalled. There was this young woman creeping toward a massive bull, and the bull was clearly aware of her. His whole posture had changed. He'd gone from relaxed grazing to what I can only describe as coiled tension, like a spring being compressed. Walsh's guide, Marcus Chin, no relation to Sarah, immediately radioed the ranger station to report the dangerous situation developing. Sarah reached the fallen logs at 7:16 a.m. and carefully positioned herself in a gap between two large trunks. She had a clear sight line to Bull 2147, now only 35 to 40 yards away. Through her 70 to 200 millimeters lens, she could see individual hairs on his massive head, the scars on his hide, the morning light catching the moisture in his dark eyes. She began shooting in burst mode, her camera's shutter clicking rapidly as the bull lifted his head and stared directly at her. The images recovered from her camera showed increasing close-ups of the bull's face, his expression changing from casual awareness to focused attention. Witnesses describe a palpable shift in the atmosphere at 7:17 a.m. The normal sounds of the geyser basin, bubbling water, hissing steam, distant bird calls, seemed to fade into an ominous silence. German tourist Hans Müller was filming the scenic morning landscape when his camera captured the critical moment. The bison made this sound, Müller explained through a translator. Not loud but deep, like thunder very far. But my wife grabbed my arm and said we should leave. But we couldn't look away. Bull 2147's behavioral changes accelerated rapidly. His tail, previously hanging loose, suddenly lifted and curved into a question mark shape, a clear warning sign that any experienced bison observer would recognize as pre-charge behavior. He shook his massive head violently from side to sighed, sending bits of shed fur floating through the morning air. His front right hoof began pawing at the ground, digging a small depression in the meadowgrass. Sarah, focused through her viewfinder and perhaps misinterpreting these displays as interesting behavior to photograph, continued shooting. Park Ranger Julie Martinez received the radio call from Marcus Chen at 7:17 a.m. and immediately began moving toward the Upper Geyser Basin. From her position near Castle Geyser, approximately half a mile away, I started running as soon as I heard "photographer too close to Bison," Martinez recalled. I knew we had maybe minutes, possibly seconds, before someone got hurt. I kept trying to raise anyone closer on the radio, but morning shift change meant coverage was thin. Her body camera recorded her sprint along the boardwalk, the timestamp showing her covering the distance in under 4 minutes, but it wouldn't be fast enough. The trigger moment came at 7:18 and 23 seconds a.m., according to the synchronized timestamps from multiple cameras recording the scene. Sarah, perhaps trying for a different angle or realizing she was too close, suddenly stood up from her crouched position behind the logs. The abrupt vertical movement, combined with her bright red jacket becoming fully visible above the log line, sparked an instantaneous reaction from Bull 2147. Bradley's video captured the bull's head snapping to attention, his muscles bunching beneath his hide, his entire massive frame orienting toward Sarah's position. Everything went into slow motion, Bradley said. I saw him drop his head low, really low, and his back legs kind of gathered under him. Screamed, "Run!" as loud as I could, but she was 150 yards away with a camera pressed to her face. She couldn't hear me, or maybe she didn't, just froze. That's when I knew we were about to witness something terrible. Linda Walsh's photography group began screaming warnings from the boardwalk. Several people waved their arms frantically, trying to get Sarah's attention. Marcus Chen blew his emergency whistle in sharp, desperate blasts. But Sarah, either too focused on her photography or paralyzed by the sudden realization of danger, remained stationary for 2 critical seconds, an eternity when facing a charging bison. Then, at exactly 7:18 and 26 seconds a.m., 2,000 pounds of prehistoric fury exploded into motion. Bull 2147 launched himself forward with a power that defied his massive size, his hooves throwing up clods of earth as he accelerated from standstill to full charge in less than 3 seconds. The sound was unlike anything the witnesses had experienced, a thundering percussion that seemed to shake the very ground, mixed with a guttural bellowing that spoke of primal rage. The massive bull covered the 40 yards between himself and Sarah in less than 4 seconds, his enormous bulk moving with the terrible grace of an avalanche. Sarah's camera dropped from her face as the reality of her situation crashed through her artistic focus. Her eyes widened in terror. As 2,000 pounds of muscle and bone charged directly at her, the ground literally shaking beneath his hooves. She turned to run, but the fallen logs that she had chosen for cover now became a deadly obstacle course. Sarah's right foot caught on a protruding branch as she attempted to leap over the first log. The stumble cost her precious fractions of a second, and she went down hard on her left knee, her camera swinging wildly from its strap around her neck. Tom Bradley's video captured her desperate attempt to regain her footing, her hands clawing at the weathered wood as she tried to pull herself up and over the log barrier. "Get up! Get up!" Bradley heard himself screaming, though he knew she couldn't hear him over the thundering approach of the bull. Bull 2147 hit Sarah with the force of a compact car traveling at 35 miles per hour. His massive head, lowered in classic charge position, caught her in the lower back just as she was attempting to clear the second log. The impact was devastating. Witnesses described hearing a sound like a baseball bat hitting a sandbag, followed immediately by Sarah's scream, a sound that would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. The force of the collision launched her approximately 10 feet through the air, her body cartwheeling over the remaining logs before crashing into the ground on the other side. Linda Walsh was recording video when the impact occurred, and her camera captured the horrifying detail of what happened next. "I couldn't stop filming," Walsh later testified, tears streaming down her face. My hands were shaking so bad, but I thought maybe it would help somehow. Like evidence or something. I wish I had looked away. The video showed Sarah attempting to curl into a protective ball as Bull 2147 cleared the logs with surprising agility for his size. His eyes rolled back, showing the whites, foam flying from his mouth. The bull's front hooves came down on either side of Sarah's crumpled form, and he lowered his massive head again, using it like a battering ram against her body. Dr. Marcus Veterinary, a wildlife behavior expert who later reviewed the footage, explained the bison's actions. This wasn't feeding behavior or even normal territorial aggression. The bull had entered what we call rage state, a complete commitment to eliminating what he perceived as a threat. The repeated attacks are characteristic of bulls who feel their territory has been severely violated. Sarah tried desperately to protect herself, her arms wrapped around her head, but she was completely defenseless against the enraged animal. Bull 2147 used his head to toss her body like a rag doll, lifting her several feet off the ground before slamming her back down. Her red jacket, which had triggered his charge, was now torn and stained with blood and dirt. The bull's horns, though relatively short compared to other bovines, were still deadly weapons when propelled by such massive force. Ranger Julie Martinez arrived at the scene at 7:19 and 47 seconds a.m., her body camera recording the ongoing attack. "Stop! Stop!" she screamed, firing her bear spray toward the bull from the maximum effective range of 30 feet. The pepper spray created an orange cloud that drifted across the meadow, but Bull 2147 was too enraged to be deterred. He continued his assault, now using his front hooves to strike at Sarah's motionless form. Martinez radioed desperately for backup while searching for any way to intervene without becoming a second victim. Tom Bradley and 3 other photographers began throwing rocks and branches toward the bull, trying anything to distract him from his victim. Hans Mueller and his wife banged on the metal railings of the boardwalk, creating a cacophony of noise. Marcus Chen, the tour guide, grabbed a fallen branch and began advancing toward the scene, ignoring his own safety protocols in a desperate attempt to help. "I knew it was suicide to approach," Chen later said, "but I couldn't just stand there watching her die. I had to try something." The attack had now lasted over 90 seconds, an eternity in wildlife attack terms. Bull 2147's rage seemed to be slowly dissipating, his attacks becoming less frenzied but no less dangerous. He would back up a few steps, snort and paw the ground, then charge forward again to deliver another devastating blow with his head or hooves. Sarah had stopped moving after the first 30 seconds, her body limp and unresponsive to the continued assault. At 7:20 and 15 seconds a.m., something shifted in the bull's demeanor. Perhaps the bear spray was finally having an effect, or his territorial rage had been satisfied. He delivered one final blow with his massive head, then stepped back, shaking his own head as if clearing it. His eyes, which had been rolled back in rage, returned to their normal position. He stood over Sarah's motionless form for several long seconds, his sides heaving from exertion, steam rising from his body in the cool morning air. Wildlife Officer Richard Daniels arrived on scene in an ATV at 7:20 and 42 seconds a.m., followed closely by 2 more rangers in a Park Service truck. Daniels, 20-year veteran of Yellowstone, immediately assessed the situation. The bull was in what we call guard stance, no longer actively attacking, but ready to charge anyone who approached the victim, Daniels reported. Standard protocol is to use vehicles to create a barrier, but the terrain with all those logs made it impossible to get close enough. We had to wait for him to move on his own. The standoff lasted another agonizing 3 minutes. Sarah lay crumpled among the logs, her red jacket visible but no signs of movement. Blood had pooled beneath her, staining the gray weathered wood and seeping into the volcanic soil. Her camera, miraculously still hanging from its strap, had recorded several frames during the attack as it swung wildly, creating a disjointed visual record of ground, sky, and blurred motion. Finally, at 7:23 and 55 seconds a.m., Bull 2147 turned and walked slowly away from the scene. His gait was unhurried, almost casual, as if nothing had happened. He paused once to look back at the gathering crowd of rangers and witnesses, snorted once, then continued toward the thermal features where other bison were grazing. It was only then that emergency responders could finally reach Sarah. Paramedic team leader Jessica Howard was first to reach the victim. The scene was catastrophic, Howard later testified, her professional composure cracking slightly. Massive trauma to the torso, multiple puncture wounds from hooves, severe head trauma. But she still had a pulse. Weak and thready, but there. We immediately began advanced life support protocols while calling for the medical helicopter. The witnesses on the boardwalk stood in shocked silence, many crying, some recording on their phones, others turning away unable to process what they had just witnessed. Linda Walsh had stopped recording and was being comforted by her tour group. Tom Bradley stood frozen, his expensive camera hanging uselessly at his side, tears streaming down his weathered face. "I've photographed wildlife for 30 years, he said to no one in particular. I've never seen anything like that. The violence, the speed. She didn't have a chance." Hans Mueller's video, which captured the entire attack from a different angle, would later become crucial evidence in the investigation. Interviewed, Mueller could barely speak about what he had recorded. "In my country, we have respect for nature," he said through his translator. "But this was nature showing us we are nothing. Just soft, fragile nothing compared to its power. That poor girl learned too late." As the emergency responders worked frantically to stabilize Sarah for transport, Bull 2147 had rejoined a small group of bison near the thermal features, grazing peacefully as if the violent attack had never occurred. The morning mist was finally burning off, revealing a pristine blue sky that seemed to mock the tragedy that had just unfolded. In the distance, Old Faithful began its morning eruption, sending a column of boiling water into the air, a reminder that in Yellowstone, nature's power takes many forms, and all of them demand absolute respect. At 7:24 a.m., the first responders converged on the scene in a choreographed chaos of emergency protocols. Yellowstone's emergency response team, trained for exactly these scenarios, moved with practiced efficiency despite the horrific nature of the injuries. Paramedic Jessica Howard and her partner, EMT David Reeves, reached Sarah first, their medical bags hitting the ground as they immediately began their initial assessment. Body camera footage from their response would later be used in training scenarios as an example of maintaining professional composure under extreme circumstances. The scene that greeted them was catastrophic. Sarah lay twisted among the fallen logs, her body positioned unnaturally where Bull 2147's final impact had left her. Blood had soaked into the volcanic soil, creating a dark stain that spread outward from multiple wounds. Her red jacket, once bright and vibrant, was now torn in several places, revealing the devastating injuries beneath. Howard immediately checked for vital signs while Reeves began setting up their equipment. Female victim, approximately 20 years old, multiple trauma from wildlife attack, Howard radioed to dispatch. Pulse present but weak, respirations shallow and labored. "We need that bird in the air now." Wildlife Officer Richard Daniels maintained a vigilant watch on Bull 2147, who remained visible approximately 200 yards away with a small group of other bison. His responsibility was ensuring the safety of the medical team while they worked. "The bull showed no signs of returning," Daniels reported, "but in these situations you can't be too careful. I positioned our vehicle between the victim and the herd, ready to use it as a barrier if needed." 2 other rangers established a perimeter, keeping the growing crowd of shocked tourists at a safe distance. The medical assessment revealed the full extent of Sarah's injuries. Multiple puncture wounds from hooves peppered her torso and legs, each one potentially causing internal damage. Her left arm bent at an unnatural angle, clearly broken in multiple places from either the initial impact or the subsequent trampling. Most concerning was the obvious head trauma, a deep laceration across her scalp that bled profusely despite pressure. Bandages. Howard and Reeves worked in synchronized precision, establishing for access, administering pain medication, and preparing her for transport. Ranger Julie Martinez, who had been first on scene, worked crowd control while fighting her own emotional response. There were probably 30 people on the boardwalk by then, she recalled. Some were filming, others were crying, a few were angry, yelling about why we didn't do more to stop it. I had to keep explaining that approaching would have resulted in more casualties. One man actually tried to climb over the railing to help, and I had to physically restrain him. The diverse reactions of the witnesses created additional challenges for the responders trying to work. In an already chaotic scene, the medical helicopter, Life Flight 7, launched from Eastern Idaho Regional Medical Center at 7:26 a.m. The flight crew, consisting of pilot Captain Sarah Mitchell, flight nurse Robert Chin, and flight paramedic Angela Torres, received continuous updates during their 18-minute flight to Yellowstone. Multi-system trauma, possible internal bleeding, definite TBI, the dispatcher relayed. Patient is young, previously healthy, but mechanism of injury is severe. They're requesting you land as close as possible. They don't think she'll survive a long transport to the designated landing zone. Back at the scene, Sarah's condition was deteriorating rapidly. Her blood pressure dropped dangerously low despite 2 large-bore IVs pushing fluids. Howard noticed Sarah's abdomen becoming rigid and distended, a sure sign of internal bleeding. "We need to move her now," Howard told her partner. "She's bleeding out internally. Every second counts." They made the difficult decision to attempt moving her before full spinal immobilization could be completed, knowing the risk of paralysis was outweighed by the certainty of death from blood loss. Tom Bradley, the wildlife photographer who had witnessed the entire attack, approached Ranger Martinez with Sarah's camera, which had somehow survived the assault. "This fell off during everything," he said, his hands shaking as he handed over the equipment. "There might be important evidence on it. I didn't touch anything else." The camera's memory card would indeed prove crucial, not only for the investigation but for understanding Sarah's final moments and her state of mind leading up to the tragedy. The process of extricating Sarah from the log pile required 6 people. Rangers and emergency responders carefully lifted her onto a backboard, trying to minimize movement while racing against time. Each movement elicited involuntary groans from the unconscious victim, sounds that witnesses would later describe as haunting. Blood continued to seep through the bandages, and Howard noted with alarm that Sarah's pupils had become unequal, a sign of serious brain injury. At 7:35 a.m., Wildlife Officer Daniels made the difficult decision to haze Bull 2147 and his group further from the area. Using specialized equipment, including cracker shells, noise-making projectiles, and his vehicle's siren, he moved the bison approximately 400 yards away. "I hated to stress the animals further," Daniels explained, "but we needed to create a safe landing zone for the helicopter." The bull showed no aggression during the hazing. He had returned completely to normal behavior, which is typical after these territorial attacks. The scene on the boardwalk had become a trauma counseling situation in itself. Several witnesses showed signs of acute stress reaction, shaking, crying, some sitting on the ground unable to stand. Park interpreter Mary Yellowtail arrived to assist with crowd management and found herself providing impromptu crisis counseling. "There was a young family with 2 children who had seen everything," she recalled. "The kids were asking if the lady was going to be okay, and the parents were in complete shock. I had to gently guide them away while trying to answer their questions. Honestly but age-appropriately." Life Flight 7 appeared over the ridge at 7:44 a.m., the distinctive thrum of its rotors drawing everyone's attention skyward. Captain Mitchell expertly maneuvered the aircraft to a small clearing approximately 100 yards from the attack site, as close as she could safely land given the thermal features and crowd of people. The landing kicked up a cloud of dust and steam from nearby hot springs, creating an almost apocalyptic seen as the flight crew emerged with their equipment. Flight nurse Robert Chin took over Sarah's care from the ground team, his experienced eyes quickly assessing the gravity of the situation. Was circling the drain, he would later testify using medical slang for a patient near death. Blood pressure barely palpable, obvious internal. Bleeding, blown left pupil. We started blood products immediately and prepared for emergency procedures during flight. The transfer to the helicopter's gurney was swift but careful, with 8 people supporting various parts of Sarah's body and equipment. As they loaded Sarah into the helicopter, her GPS watch recorded her heart rate at 142 beats per minute, tachycardic from blood loss, while her blood pressure had dropped to a critical 78/44. Flight paramedic Angela Torres worked to establish a second 4-line while Chin hung units of negative blood. We carry whole blood for exactly these situations, Torres explained. Plasma and packed cells aren't enough when someone's bleeding out this fast. She needed volume, and she needed it yesterday. The helicopter lifted off at 7:52 a.m., banking sharply toward Idaho Falls and advanced trauma care. As it disappeared over the eastern mountains, those left behind stood in stunned silence. The attack site remained cordoned off, blood-stained logs and torn earth bearing witness to the violence that had shattered the morning peace. Ranger Martinez began the grim task of collecting evidence: Sarah's backpack, torn pieces of clothing, and the camera that had documented her final, fatal pursuit of the perfect shot. Sarah Chin fought for her life for 7 hours and 23 minutes at Eastern Idaho Regional Medical Center. The trauma team, led by Dr. Michael Harrison, worked with desperate efficiency as Life Flight 7 touched down on the hospital's helipad at 8:11 a.m. Sarah was rushed directly into Trauma Bay 1, where a team of 12 medical professionals stood ready. Dr. Harrison's initial assessment confirmed what the flight crew had reported: massive internal bleeding, severe traumatic brain injury, multiple fractures, and deep tissue damage from both penetrating and blunt force trauma. The surgical team performed an emergency laparotomy, discovering catastrophic damage to Sarah's liver and spleen, along with multiple intestinal perforations. The force of the impact had essentially crushed her internal organs, Dr. Harrison explained at the subsequent press conference. We repaired what we could, removed her spleen entirely, and resected portions of her liver. But the damage was simply too extensive. Sarah received 14 units of blood during surgery, her body struggling to maintain even basic functions as the team fought to control the hemorrhaging. At 2:47 p.m. Mountain Time, despite Herculean efforts from the medical team, Sarah Chen's heart stopped beating. Resuscitation efforts continued for another 37 minutes, but the young woman who had sought to capture the wild beauty of Yellowstone had become another casualty of the dangerous intersection between human ambition and natural power. The official cause of death was listed as multiple organ failure, secondary to massive trauma sustained in wildlife attack. She was 22 years old. Dr. Linda Chen and James Chen had chartered a private plane from San Francisco the moment they received the call about their daughter's attack. They arrived at the hospital at 1:15 p.m., in time to be with Sarah for her final moments. We held her hands, Linda later said in a statement read by their attorney. We told her we loved her, that we were proud of her, that it was okay to let go. No parent should have to give their child permission to die. The Chens requested that Sarah's organs be donated, and despite the trauma, her heart, kidneys, and corneas would go on to save 4 lives, a final act of giving from a young woman who had dedicated her life to conservation and care for others. Bull 2147 was located by park rangers at 10:45 a.m. the same day, grazing peacefully with a bachelor group near Fountain Paint Pot. The decision about his fate sparked immediate controversy. Yellowstone's wildlife management protocol typically calls for the removal of animals that kill humans, but the circumstances of Sarah's death complicated the decision. She had clearly violated park regulations by approaching within the minimum safe distance, and the bull had exhibited normal defensive behavior rather than predatory aggression. After extensive deliberation involving Park Superintendent Cameron Roberts, regional wildlife managers, and consultation with national parks service headquarters, the decision was made not to euthanize bull 2147. This was a defensive action by a wild animal in its natural habitat. Roberts explained at a press conference 3 days later. The tragic loss of Ms. Chen's life was the result of human error, not abnormal animal behavior. Destroying this bison would not bring her back and would set a dangerous precedent that wildlife must pay for human mistakes. The decision sparked fierce debate on social media, with opinions sharply divided between those calling for the bull's death and those supporting the park's decision. The investigation into Sarah's death was thorough and unsparing. Led by Chief Ranger Marcus Thompson, the team analyzed witness statements, video footage, and the images from Sarah's own camera. The investigation concluded that Sarah had willfully violated park regulations by approaching within 25 yards of wildlife, had ignored multiple warning signs of aggressive behavior from the bull, and had positioned herself in a location that prevented easy escape. The 47-page report, released 6 weeks after the incident, became required reading for park staff and was incorporated into visitor safety briefings. The Chen family, through their attorney David Williamson, initially indicated they would pursue legal action against the National Park Service for failure to adequately protect visitors. However, after reviewing the investigation findings and witnessing the video evidence of their daughter's actions, they withdrew any plans for litigation. Instead, they announced the creation of the Sarah Chen Wildlife Safety Foundation, dedicated to educating photographers and tourists about safe wildlife viewing practices. Sarah died doing what she loved, James Chen said at the foundation's launch. We want her death to mean something, to save others from making the same tragic mistakes. The Yellowstone community was profoundly shaken by Sarah's death. Local businesses reported a 15% drop in wildlife tour bookings in the weeks following the incident, as visitors expressed new fears about encountering bison. The park responded by implementing enhanced safety measures, including doubling the number of wildlife safety volunteers during peak season, installing additional warning signs in multiple languages, and creating a mandatory safety video that played on loop at visitor centers. Rangers reported a marked increase in visitor compliance with wildlife viewing distances in the months following the tragedy. A memorial service for Sarah was held in San Francisco on May 22, attended by over 500 people including classmates from Columbia, colleagues from her internships, and members of the conservation community. Professor Rachel Thompson delivered a eulogy that captured the complexity of the loss. Sarah represented the best of the next generation of conservationists, passionate, educated, committed to protecting the wild places she loved. That her life was lost in pursuit of that passion is a tragedy that should inspire us not to fear nature, but to respect it even more deeply. The impact on wildlife photography communities was immediate and profound. Professional photography organizations issued new guidelines, emphasizing safety over capturing images. The National Association of Nature Photographers created the Sarah Chen Safety Protocol, requiring members to pledge adherence to all wildlife viewing regulations. Tom Bradley, who had witnessed the attack, became an outspoken advocate for telephoto lens use and safe distances. No photograph is worth a life, he repeated at workshops and seminars. I wake up at night still seeing that. If sharing that trauma saves even one person from making Sarah's mistake, then I'll keep talking about it. Legal proceedings following the incident were minimal but significant. The Chen family's decision not to pursue litigation was influenced by a meeting with Ranger Julie Martinez, who had been first on scene. Martinez shared the full video footage with the family and explained the extensive safety measures already in place. They needed to understand that Sarah wasn't failed by the system, Martinez recalled. She was educated, experienced, and made a conscious choice to violate safety protocols. It was the hardest conversation I've ever had, but they deserved the complete truth. 6 months after the incident, Yellowstone hosted a wildlife safety summit that brought together park officials, wildlife biologists, photographers, and tour operators. The summit resulted in new industry standards for wildlife viewing, including recommended equipment specifications, standardized hand signals for warning other photographers of dangerous situations, and a peer intervention protocol encouraging experienced photographers to speak up when witnessing unsafe behavior. The summit was dedicated to Sarah's memory, with her parents delivering the keynote address. The ongoing impact of Sarah's death extended far beyond Yellowstone. Wildlife reserves and national parks worldwide reviewed and strengthened their safety protocols. Several parks implemented Yellowstone's model of increased volunteer safety ambassadors. Social media platforms partnered with conservation organizations to add automatic warnings to posts featuring close wildlife encounters, directing viewers to safety. Resources. The hashtag #SafeDistanceSavesLives, started by the Chen Family Foundation, became a rallying cry for responsible wildlife viewing. 1 year after the tragedy, a small bronze plaque was installed at the Old Faithful Visitor Center. It didn't mark the site of Sarah's death, the park service didn't want to create a morbid attraction, but instead honored all victims of wildlife encounters in the park. The plaque read simply, "In memory of those whose love of nature led them too close. May their loss teach us that respect means distance, and that the wild must always remain wild." Sarah Chin, 2002 to 2025. Dr. James Morrison, who has studied Yellowstone's bison behavior for 23 years and published over 40 peer-reviewed papers on megafauna aggression patterns, analyzed every frame of the video footage from Sarah's attack. What we witnessed was a textbook example of defensive territorial aggression, Dr. Morrison explains from his office at Montana State University. Bull 2147 exhibited 13 distinct pre-charge warning behaviors over a period of approximately 4 minutes. These included tail raising, head shaking, pawing, postural changes, and vocalizations. Any one of these should have triggered immediate retreat from Ms. Chen. The fact that she continued approaching despite this cascade of warnings indicates a fundamental misreading of animal communication. The attack pattern analysis revealed disturbing insights into how quickly a wildlife encounter can turn fatal. Dr. Morrison identified 3 distinct phases in Bull 2147's response: initial awareness and assessment, lasting approximately 2 minutes, escalating agitation, 90 seconds, and the explosive charge phase, less than 10 seconds from decision to impact. Bison can accelerate from 0 to 35 miles per hour in under 3 seconds, he notes. Once a bull commits to charging, the window for human escape essentially closes. At 40 yards, the distance Ms. Chen maintained, she had perhaps 4 seconds to react. Given the obstacle of the fallen logs she chose for cover, escape was mathematically impossible. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a trauma surgeon with extensive experience treating wildlife attack victims, reviewed Sarah's medical records and injury patterns. The initial impact delivered approximately 4,000 pounds of force concentrated into an area roughly the size of a dinner plate, Dr. Martinez states. This is equivalent to being hit by a small car at highway speeds. The primary impact fractured 7 ribs, lacerated her liver, and caused massive internal hemorrhaging. But it was the secondary injuries from the trampling that proved insurmountable. Strike delivered between 800 and 1,200 pounds of pressure per square inch. The human body simply isn't designed to withstand such forces. The medical analysis revealed that Sarah's injuries followed a predictable pattern seen in large ungulate attacks. The initial charge typically targets the torso, causing massive blunt force trauma. Secondary injuries come from hooves as the animal attempts to neutralize what it perceives as a threat. In reviewing 50 years of bison attack data, we see that victims who remain motionless after the initial impact have a significantly higher survival rate, Dr. Martinez explains. Movement triggers continued aggression. Unfortunately, the human instinct to curl into a protective position is interpreted by the animal as continued threat activity. Wildlife safety expert Dr. Patricia Kellerman, who has developed training protocols for parks across North America, emphasizes the cascade of preventable decisions that led to the tragedy. Ms. Chen made 7 critical errors that morning, Dr. Kellerman states, consulting her analysis. First, entering a known wildlife area alone during peak activity hours. Second, choosing photography equipment that required close proximity. Third, ignoring posted warnings about recent aggressive behavior. Fourth, misinterpreting habituation for safety. Fifth, using stalking, behavior that triggered predator response instincts. Sixth, positioning herself in an area with limited escape routes. And seventh, the fatal error, standing up abruptly when the animal was already agitated. Dr. Kellerman has studied thousands of wildlife encounters, both fatal and non-fatal, to identify patterns that could save lives. The 25-yard rule isn't arbitrary, she emphasizes. It's based on extensive research into charge distances, human reaction times, and escape possibilities. At 25 yards, most people have sufficient time to reach safety or implement defensive strategies. At 40 yards, where Ms. Chen positioned herself, margin of error shrinks dramatically. Factor in obstacles like fallen logs, uneven terrain, or bulky camera equipment, and that margin disappears entirely. Psychological expert Dr. Amanda Richards, who specializes in risk assessment in outdoor recreation, explains the cognitive biases that contributed to Sarah's fatal decisions. Ms. Chen exhibited what we call expert syndrome combined with optimism bias, Dr. Richards notes. Her education and experience created a false sense of immunity to danger. She knew the statistics intellectually but believed they didn't apply to her. This is surprisingly common among wildlife professionals and enthusiasts. The more successful encounters they have, the more they unconsciously recalibrate their risk tolerance upward. Dr. Richards' research has identified specific personality traits that correlate with wildlife incidents. High-achieving individuals with strong confidence in their abilities are paradoxically at greater risk, she explains. They're more likely to push boundaries, dismiss warnings from others, and believe they can control uncontrollable situations. Ms. Chen's social media presence showed classic signs of this pattern, increasingly close encounters presented as evidence of her special connection with wildlife rather than recognized as escalating risk-taking behavior. Legal expert Jonathan Blackwood, who has consulted on dozens of wildlife attack cases, discusses the complex liability issues surrounding such incidents. Yellowstone National Park has what we call assumption of risk clearly established, Blackwood explains. Visitors are warned repeatedly through signage, pamphlets, ranger talks, and even roadside encounters that wildlife is dangerous and unpredictable. Mission with her educational background and experience had what we term superior knowledge of these risks. Legally, the park fulfilled and exceeded its duty to warn. The decision not to destroy the bison was also legally sound. The animal exhibited normal defensive behavior in its natural habitat. The legal framework surrounding wildlife attacks in national parks has evolved through decades of precedent-setting cases. The fundamental principle is that these parks preserve wild spaces where animals have right-of-way, Blackwood continues. Visitors enter at their own risk. The only exceptions involve animals with abnormal behavior patterns, predatory attacks on humans following proper protocols, for instance. 2147's behavior, while tragic in outcome, was entirely within normal parameters for his species. He responded to a perceived threat with typical defensive aggression. Comparative analysis reveals troubling patterns across similar incidents. Dr. Morrison compiled data from 147 bison attacks over the past 50 years, finding that 89% involved visitors approaching within the minimum safe distance. The consistency is remarkable and depressing. Despite endless education efforts, people continue to believe they're exceptions to the rules. Ms. Chen's case is unique only in that she had more education than most victims. It proves that knowledge without respect is perhaps more dangerous than simple ignorance. The experts unanimously agree on key prevention strategies. Dr. Kellerman summarizes: maintain minimum distances, 25 yards for bison, 100 yards for bears. Use optical zoom, not your feet. Never position yourself between an animal and its escape route. If an animal changes its behavior because of your presence, you're too close. These aren't suggestions, they're survival requirements. Dr. Morrison adds, people need to understand that wildlife viewing is not a right, it's a privilege that comes with absolute responsibility for your own safety. The psychological impact on witnesses provides another layer of expert analysis. Dr. Richards has counseled several people who witnessed Sarah's attack, finding consistent trauma patterns. Witnessing a fatal wildlife attack creates a specific type of post-traumatic stress, she explains. The speed of the transition from peaceful scene to extreme violence, the helplessness of being unable to intervene, the sounds and visual images. These create lasting psychological impacts. Several witnesses reported being unable to return to Yellowstone, experiencing nightmares, and developing heightened anxiety around large animals. Dr. Morrison's final analysis provides perhaps the most sobering perspective. In my career studying bison, I've seen them demonstrate remarkable tolerance for human stupidity. Thousands of times each year, visitors violate safe distances and nothing happens. But this creates a false narrative that bison are gentle giants. They're not. They're wild animals that tolerate us until they don't. Ms. Chen's death reminds us that in the split second when tolerance ends, physics and biology take over, and humans always lose that equation. Sarah Chen's tragedy teaches us the most fundamental lesson of wildlife interaction. Respect measured in distance is the only currency that matters in the wild. Sarah possessed knowledge, passion, and experience, but she lacked the humility to accept that wild animals owe humans nothing, not photo opportunities, not tolerance, not mercy. Her story serves as a stark reminder that in the moment when prehistoric instinct meets modern ambition, our fragile human bodies become nothing more than obstacles to be eliminated. The prevention lessons from Sarah's death are clear and uncompromising. First, the 25-yard minimum distance from bison isn't a suggestion, it's a survival requirement based on charge speeds, human reaction times, and the brutal mathematics of mass versus velocity. When a 2,000-pound animal charges at 35 miles per hour, it generates the same impact force as a pickup truck. No amount of athletic ability, wildlife knowledge, or pure luck can overcome these physics. Second, warning behaviors must trigger immediate retreat, not closer inspection. Tail raising, head shaking, pawing, snorting, or any change in behavior means you've already violated the animal's comfort zone. Third, escape routes must always be clear, unobstructed, and tested. Fallen logs, thermal features, and rough terrain transform from photogenic elements to death traps in seconds. Sarah's legacy lives on through multiple channels of positive change. The Sarah Chen Wildlife Safety Foundation, established by her grieving parents, has educated over 50,000 photographers and tourists in its first year alone. Their signature program, Distance Equals Respect, provides free telephoto lens rentals at major national parks, removing the equipment excuse for approaching wildlife. The foundation's powerful tagline, "She died for a photo that could have been taken from 100 yards away," appears on warning signs throughout Yellowstone and has been adopted by parks worldwide. Dr. Linda Chen channels her grief into powerful advocacy, speaking at photography workshops and conservation conferences. Sarah believed her. Knowledge protected her, Linda tells audiences, her voice steady despite the pain. But knowledge without humility is worthless in the wild. Daughter's last photo showed a bison that was clearly agitated, clearly warning her. She saw it as an interesting behavior to capture. The misreading cost her life. If her story saves even one person from making that same fatal error, then perhaps her death serves a purpose. The policy changes implemented after Sarah's death represent the most comprehensive wildlife safety overhaul in National Park Service history. Yellowstone now requires all visitors to watch a mandatory 3-minute safety video before receiving their park pass. The video includes actual footage of bison charges, clear demonstrations of warning behaviors, and testimonials from attack survivors. Park statistics show a 67% reduction in close approach incidents since implementation. Additionally, roving wildlife safety ambassadors, volunteers trained in intervention techniques, patrol high-traffic areas during peak season, empowered to issue warnings and summon rangers when visitors violate safety zones. The technological solutions emerging from this tragedy offer hope for prevention. A new app, Safe Shot, developed partly with funding from the Chen Foundation, uses augmented reality to show photographers exactly how close they are to wildlife and provides real-time alerts when they're entering danger zones. The app includes species-specific warning signs, escape route mapping, and automatic emergency calls if users don't respond to proximity alerts. Over 100,000 downloads in the first 6 months suggest photographers are embracing technology-assisted safety. Professional photography organizations have undergone soul-searching reassessments of their practices. The International Wildlife Photography Ethics Board, formed in response to Sarah's death, now requires members to include GPS metadata proving safe distances for any competition. Submissions. Several prestigious contests have been won by photographers who captured stunning images from 200+ yards away, proving definitively that proximity doesn't equal quality. Tom Bradley, the photographer who witnessed Sarah's attack, has become the board's most vocal advocate. Every time I'm tempted to move closer, I see her red jacket in my mind. No image is worth someone's life. Not one. The impact on park visitation patterns reveals complex public responses to high-profile wildlife attacks. While some tour operators reported initial booking decreases, Yellowstone's overall visitation increased by 12% the year following Sarah's death. Surveys indicated visitors felt safer due to enhanced safety measures, and many specifically cited wanting to see bison from a respectful distance after learning about the tragedy. The park's gift shops report telephoto lens rentals increased by 400%, suggesting visitors are taking safety messages seriously. Educational initiatives have expanded beyond parks into schools and communities. The Chen Foundation partnered with National Geographic to create Wild Respect, a curriculum taught in over 3,000 schools. Students learn about wildlife behavior, safe viewing practices, and the consequences of human-wildlife conflict. The program's most powerful element is a virtual reality experience that puts students in Sarah's position, showing how quickly a peaceful wildlife encounter can turn deadly. Teachers report profound impacts on student understanding of wildlife safety. The role of social media in perpetuating dangerous wildlife interactions has faced scrutiny. Platforms now flag posts showing unsafe wildlife encounters, adding warning labels and links to safety resources. The "do it for the gram" mentality that drives risky behavior for social media. Content has been countered by influencers sharing Sarah's story and promoting safe wildlife photography. The hashtag #SafeDistanceSavesLives has been used over 10 million times, often accompanying stunning wildlife photos taken with appropriate telephoto lenses. Research into wildlife behavior continues to evolve, partly inspired by Sarah's case. Dr. Morrison's team has identified subtle pre-warning behaviors in bison that occur up to 10 minutes before obvious agitation. This research, funded by the Chen Foundation, aims to create early warning systems that could alert visitors before situations escalate. If we can teach people to recognize the subtle signs, slight ear positioning changes, breathing patterns, minor posture shifts, we can prevent encounters from reaching the danger zone, Morrison explains. The anniversary of Sarah's death has become an unofficial Wildlife Safety Awareness Day in the conservation community. Parks offer free telephoto lens workshops, safety demonstrations, and memorial programs. Sarah's brother Michael, now a doctor himself, speaks at medical schools about wildlife trauma, ensuring future physicians understand both the medical and preventive aspects of animal attacks. Sarah died because she forgot that loving nature doesn't mean nature loves you back. He tells students, respect must always trump affection when dealing with wildlife. The legal precedents established by the Chen family's decision not to pursue litigation have influenced subsequent cases. Their public statement that parks must remain wild, and wildness includes danger, has been cited in multiple legal proceedings. This principled stance, despite their devastating loss, has helped preserve the fundamental character of wild spaces while encouraging personal responsibility among visitors. For those of us who venture into wild places, Sarah Chen's story serves as an eternal reminder. We are visitors in territories that belong to creatures who survived ice ages, predators, and human encroachment through raw power and instinct. Our cameras, our knowledge, our passion for wildlife, none of these grant us immunity from the fundamental laws of nature. The wild doesn't care about your Instagram followers, your degree, or your good intentions. It responds only to behavior, and when that behavior crosses invisible but absolute boundaries, the consequences are swift, brutal, and final. As you plan your next adventure into places where wildlife roams free, remember Sarah Chen. Remember that she did everything right except maintain distance. Remember that Bull 2147 wasn't evil or aggressive, he was simply wild, responding as millions of years of evolution programmed him to respond. Most importantly, remember that the difference between a breathtaking wildlife encounter and a tragedy can be measured in yards, yards that should never be crossed, no matter how perfect the light, how rare the opportunity, or how confident you feel. Share this story with fellow adventurers, photographers, and nature lovers. Subscribe to Wildlife Encounters Uncovered for more critical safety content that could save your life or the life of someone you love. Hit the notification bell, because understanding these tragic encounters is the first step to preventing them. Sarah Chen's parents asked that her story be told honestly, brutally, and repeatedly, believing that discomfort with the details might translate to caution in the field. The wilderness will always call to those who hear its song. Answer that call, but answer it with the wisdom Sarah's death provides. Use long lenses. Respect barriers. Heed warnings. Accept that the price of admission to nature's greatest shows is maintaining a respectful distance. This, and you honor not just Sarah's memory, but the wild itself, keeping it wild for generations who will follow our footsteps, hopefully at a safer distance. Remember, nature doesn't offer second chances. Sarah Chen proved that on a misty morning in Yellowstone, transforming from a promising young scientist to a cautionary tale in less time than it takes to read this sentence. Don't let her death be in vain. Distance equals respect. Respect equals survival. This is the ultimate lesson from the tragedy of Sarah Chen, a lesson written in blood among the fallen logs of Yellowstone, echoing across every wild place where humans and animals meet.